The officer's voice was sharp, cutting through the buzz of the crowded park like a knife. "What are you doing here? Don't you know this isn't a place for you?" He didn't wait for a response. His boot swung high, striking the man square in the ribs as onlookers gasped, some too stunned to move, others reaching for their phones. The man stumbled but didn't fall. His steady gaze met the officer's with an intensity that made everyone pause. He said nothing, his silence louder than the officer's barked accusations. "You think you can just stand there, pretending to help someone? Don't act like I don't know what you're up to." The officer's face was red with a mix of rage and misplaced authority. "Hands behind your back. Now." The man, tall and commanding in stature, didn't flinch. His quiet strength radiated through the chaos, but the injustice of the moment clawed at him. Moments earlier, he had rushed to assist an elderly man who had tripped and fallen near a bench. The simple act of kindness had turned into a nightmare when the officer arrived, weaponizing his authority without hesitation or justification. "I said now," the officer barked again, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it violently. People in the crowd murmured in disbelief, some whispering, others frozen in place. "He didn't do anything," a young woman said, clutching her child's hand. "He was just helping that old man." But the officer's focus was unwavering. "You people always have an excuse," he spat, shoving the man against the park bench. "I've seen your type before. Always up to no good, thinking you can outsmart the system." The man's breathing slowed, each breath deliberate, as if he was gathering something deep within himself. "Are you done?" he finally asked, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of humiliation and anger. The officer smirked, misinterpreting the question as submission. "Oh, I'm just getting started." The man's next words sent a chill through the air. "You don't know who I am. But you will." The officer's laugh was hollow, filled with arrogance. "I don't care who you think you are. Around here, you're just another." His words trailed off as the man straightened himself, his composure unsettlingly calm. There was something unshakable in his stance, something that hinted at a power far greater than anyone had anticipated. The crowd began to shift, murmurs growing louder. "Isn't that," someone whispered. A few in the crowd seemed to recognize him, their eyes widening as the realization hit. But the officer remained oblivious, his own prejudices blinding him to the gravity of the situation. "Call your backup," the man said, his tone like steel. "You're going to need it." For a moment, the officer faltered, his authority no longer feeling as secure as it had moments ago. The man wasn't reacting the way people usually did in these situations. There was no panic, no begging, no fear, just a quiet, unyielding defiance that made the officer's confidence crack. The crowd's whispers grew louder, the tension almost unbearable. Someone held up their phone, recording every second. The elderly man who had been helped finally spoke up, his voice trembling but firm. "This man saved me. He's a hero, and you're treating him like a criminal." But the officer ignored him, doubling down on his aggression. "Stay out of this," he barked, his eyes darting nervously between the man and the growing crowd. Then, in a single, calculated move, the man stepped forward, his presence towering over the officer. "Do you want to escalate this further?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. "Because if you do, the consequences won't just fall on me." The officer's face twisted in confusion, then anger. "What are you trying to say?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned his gaze to the crowd, locking eyes with a few familiar faces. He knew the truth would come out, and when it did, it wouldn't just shake the officer, it would send shockwaves through the entire system. The officer's radio crackled, interrupting the tense standoff. A voice on the other end was calling his name, urgent and insistent. He hesitated, his grip on control slipping further with each passing second. As the crowd closed in, phones held high to capture every detail, the man finally broke his silence. "You'll regret this," he said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. And in that moment, everyone watching knew something monumental was about to unfold. What happened next would leave the officer stunned, the crowd speechless, and the entire city questioning everything they thought they knew about justice, authority, and what it truly means to stand tall in the face of prejudice. Who was this man? And how would his quiet power turn the tables on a system designed to break him? Only one thing was certain: the officer had no idea just how deeply he had miscalculated, and the price of his arrogance would be far greater than he could have ever imagined. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To our black audience, we want you to know, your voice matters, your experiences are valid, and you deserve respect and dignity, always. This story highlights the injustice many face and reminds us all of the power of resilience and truth. Now, sit back and enjoy a gripping story of courage, redemption, and an unexpected twist. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more powerful narratives like this. Let's dive in. The park was alive with activity on that crisp Saturday morning. Joggers pounded the pathways, couples strolled hand in hand, and children laughed as they chased each other across the open lawns. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of traffic from the nearby streets. For many, it was just another weekend escape, a moment of peace in the midst of life's constant demands. But for Elijah Carter, this morning wasn't about leisure. It was about staying grounded, about finding a sense of normalcy in a world that often stripped it away from him. Elijah was a man of quiet dignity, standing tall with an air of confidence that was hard to miss. At 42, his years in the military had sculpted him into a disciplined and resolute individual. His dark skin, smooth and radiant under the sunlight, bore the faint scars of a life marked by challenges and triumphs. His eyes, sharp, steady, and unyielding, told stories of battles fought both on and off the field. Elijah had dedicated his life to service, earning his rank as captain in the United States Army through perseverance, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Yet, despite his accolades, he remained humble, a man who believed in the power of actions over words. Elijah had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a modest home with his mother and two younger sisters. Life hadn't been easy, but his mother had instilled in him the values of hard work and resilience. Joining the military had been his way of carving out a better future, not just for himself but for his family. Over the years, he'd built a reputation as a natural leader, someone who inspired respect without demanding it. But beneath the composed exterior was a man deeply aware of the biases that followed him. He knew that his uniform shielded him in some spaces but painted a target on his back in others. It was a delicate balance, one he had learned to navigate with patience and grace. The park was one of Elijah's favorite places. It reminded him of his childhood days, playing football with friends on patches of uneven grass. Today, he was dressed casually in a plain gray hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers, blending in with the crowd. But even without his uniform, his posture and presence made him stand out. He carried a water bottle in one hand and a towel draped over his shoulder, taking his time as he walked the perimeter of the park, enjoying the simplicity of the moment. On the other side of the park, Officer Derek Marshall was conducting what he referred to as his routine rounds. Derek was a 38-year-old patrol officer who had spent over a decade in law enforcement. He was broad-shouldered, with a square jaw that he often clenched when speaking, giving him an air of perpetual authority. His uniform was always impeccably pressed, his badge polished to a gleam. But Derek's demeanor often left much to be desired. Those who worked alongside him knew him as a man quick to judge and even quicker to act, sometimes recklessly so. He prided himself on being a no-nonsense enforcer of the law, though many questioned whether his actions were driven more by personal bias than a true sense of justice. Derek had grown up in a small town in Missouri, raised in a family that had strong opinions about knowing your place. Over the years, those beliefs had cemented themselves into his worldview, shaping the way he approached his job. To Derek, the world was divided into two types of people, those who followed the rules and those who didn't. And he had a particular knack for assuming who belonged in the latter category, often based on appearance alone. His colleagues had warned him about his temper, but Derek dismissed their concerns, insisting that he knew how to handle situations better than anyone else. As fate would have it, Derek's path crossed Elijah's that morning. The encounter was set into motion when an elderly man stumbled near a bench, dropping his bag of groceries. Elijah, seeing the man struggle, rushed over without hesitation, his military instincts kicking in. He knelt beside the man, gently helping him to his feet and gathering the scattered items with care. The elderly man, frail but appreciative, thanked Elijah profusely, patting his arm as he spoke. Elijah smiled, offering a reassuring nod as he handed the man his belongings. From a distance, Derek watched the interaction unfold, his eyes narrowing. He had been observing Elijah for a few minutes, his mind already weaving a narrative that fit his preconceived notions. A tall black man in a hoodie, hovering near an older white man, it was enough to ignite Derek's suspicions. Without bothering to assess the situation fully, he began striding toward them, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. Elijah stood, his back turned to Derek, as he ensured the elderly man was steady on his feet. He didn't notice the officer's approach until Derek's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Step away. Hands where I can see them." The sudden command startled both Elijah and the elderly man. Elijah turned slowly, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the situation. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "Don't play games with me," Derek snapped, his tone laced with authority and irritation. "I saw what you were doing." "What I was doing?" Elijah repeated, confusion evident on his face. "I was helping him." Derek's eyes flicked to the elderly man, who opened his mouth to speak, but Derek cut him off. "I'll handle this." "Step back, sir." Elijah's patience began to waver, but he kept his composure. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "I don't think so," Derek said, stepping closer, his hand tightening on his belt. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Elijah's jaw clenched as a crowd began to gather, their murmurs growing louder with each passing second. The humiliation of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders, but he refused to let it break him. He knew better than to resist, yet the sheer injustice of the situation burned in his chest. He glanced at the elderly man, whose attempts to intervene were ignored, and then at the crowd, whose eyes were filled with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. The tension hung thick in the air, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Derek's voice barked another order, but Elijah's mind was already racing. He could feel the weight of every assumption, every stereotype, pressing down on him. But beneath the frustration and anger, a fire was building, a quiet resolve that would soon change everything. Elijah's breath was steady, though every muscle in his body ached with restraint. He stood there, hands raised slightly, as Derek's sharp commands echoed across the park. The crowd had grown, their whispers blending into an uneasy hum. People were pulling out their phones, recording the scene unfolding in front of them. Elijah could feel the weight of their gazes, a mix of curiosity, fear, and disbelief, pressing down on him. His instincts told him to speak, to explain, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Men like Derek weren't interested in explanations, they thrived on control, on making people like Elijah feel small. "Turn around, now," Derek barked again, stepping closer, his hand hovering near his holster. "Do you need me to repeat myself?" Elijah took a slow, measured breath, his eyes meeting Derek's with a calm intensity. "Officer, I'm not resisting. I've done nothing wrong. There's no need for this." Derek's jaw tightened, his lips curling into a sneer. "Don't tell me what's necessary. I know your type. You think you can just walk around, act like you're above the rules. Not on my watch." From the edge of the crowd, the elderly man Elijah had helped tried once more to intervene. "Officer, you've got it all wrong. This man, sir." "Step back," Derek snapped, cutting him off without even looking in his direction. I said I've got it under control. Elijah's hands lowered slightly as his voice grew firmer. You're making a mistake. Whatever you think you saw, it's not what happened. I was helping him. That's all. Helping him? Derek scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that what you call it? I've seen enough to know better. Now, are you going to comply, or do I need to make you? The tension in the air was suffocating, and the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. A woman near the front called out, her voice trembling but determined. Why are you doing this? He didn't do anything wrong. We all saw it. Derek shot her a glare. Stay out of this. This doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us, the woman fired back, her words igniting a ripple of agreement through the onlookers. Elijah could feel the atmosphere shifting. The crowd was no longer just observing, they were beginning to push back, questioning Derek's actions. But he also knew how dangerous that could be. Escalation could lead to chaos, and chaos often ended in tragedy. Let's not do this here, Elijah said quietly, his voice low but resolute. You're not hearing me, and I'm not trying to make this worse. Let's step aside, talk this through like men. Derek laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Like men? You think you're in a position to make demands? You don't dictate how this goes. I do. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. His calmness wasn't submission, it was control, a mastery of emotions that Derek clearly lacked. And that control only seemed to infuriate the officer more. The elderly man, now shaking with frustration, raised his voice. Officer, you don't understand who this man is. You're making a fool of yourself. Derek turned sharply, his face flushed. I said step back. Don't make me repeat myself. The crowd was shifting now, their collective energy buzzing with unease. People were stepping closer, their phones capturing every angle. Derek noticed, his eyes darting around as if realizing for the first time just how many people were watching. His hand hovered closer to his holster, a silent threat that sent a chill through the air. You don't want to do this, Elijah said, his voice like steel. Trust me. Is that a threat? Derek snarled, his fingers tightening around his belt. You threatening me now? It's not a threat. It's advice, Elijah replied, his tone even. You don't know what you're walking into. And when you find out, it's going to hit you harder than anything you've ever faced. For a brief moment, Derek hesitated. Something in Elijah's words, in the way he stood there so unwavering, unsettled him. But his pride, his unchecked ego, wouldn't let him back down. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice lowering into a growl. Let me make something clear, Derek said, his words slow and deliberate. I don't care who you think you are. Out here, I'm in charge. You're just another guy who thought he could get away with it. But not today. Elijah's silence was deafening, his eyes locked on Derek's with an intensity that made the officer shift uncomfortably. The crowd had grown quiet again, their collective breath held as the tension reached its breaking point. And then, in the stillness, Elijah spoke once more. Officer, he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the faintest whisper. You've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Derek opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the crackle of his radio interrupted. A voice came through, sharp and urgent. Marshal, report back immediately. We need you at HQ. Derek's face twisted with annoyance, but there was a flicker of something else, uncertainty. He glanced at Elijah, then at the crowd, his grip on control slipping further with every passing second. Elijah didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, unyielding, as if he knew something no one else did. And in that moment, it was clear, whatever came next would change everything. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, their phones still raised, their eyes darting between Elijah and Derek. The officer's hand hovered near his holster once more, but it was clear that the power in the situation had shifted. Elijah's calm defiance, his refusal to break under pressure, had turned the tables in a way no one had expected. As Derek's radio crackled again, the tension reached a fever pitch. The crowd leaned in, their collective curiosity palpable. And as Elijah stood there, his composure unshaken, one question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken: what would happen when the truth finally came to light? The air felt heavier as the murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their collective anticipation swirling around Derek and Elijah like an unspoken force. Elijah remained still, his gaze steady, unyielding, a contrast to Derek's twitching hands and darting eyes. The tension wasn't just palpable, it was suffocating. Derek's radio crackled again, the voice on the other end sharp and insistent. "Marshal, report to HQ immediately. Priority directive. Drop what you're doing and get back here now." Derek's jaw clenched as he reached for the radio, his movements stiff and robotic. His frustration boiled beneath the surface, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. "I'm in the middle of something," he barked into the receiver, his voice taut with irritation. "This can wait." "It can't," the voice snapped back, leaving no room for argument. "You're needed immediately. This is coming from the top." Derek's grip tightened around the radio, his knuckles turning white. He glanced at Elijah, his frustration shifting into something darker, a storm brewing in his expression. "You're lucky," he muttered, his tone dripping with venom. "But this isn't over." Elijah's voice was calm, measured, cutting through the officer's bitterness like a blade. "You should listen to them. Trust me, you don't want to ignore that call." Derek sneered, his pride refusing to concede even an inch. He shot one last glare at Elijah before turning away, the crowd parting reluctantly as he stormed toward his patrol car. The unease in the air didn't dissipate, if anything, it thickened as Derek drove off, leaving behind a buzzing energy that lingered around Elijah. The elderly man approached Elijah again, his hands trembling but his voice steady. "You handled that better than most would've," he said, his eyes searching Elijah's face for answers. "But I get the feeling this isn't the end of it." Elijah offered a faint smile, his tone soft but resolute. "It never is." The crowd began to disperse, though the tension didn't completely fade. Some lingered, whispering, their eyes fixed on Elijah as if expecting him to say more, to do more. But Elijah remained silent, his thoughts his own. He nodded politely to those who offered words of support or encouragement, but his focus was elsewhere. His gaze lingered on the horizon, where Derek's car had disappeared, as if he knew exactly where this road was leading. The next few hours passed in a blur. Elijah returned home, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. He wasn't angry, anger was a luxury he couldn't afford, but he felt the weight of it, the injustice pressing against his chest like a heavy stone. He thought of the people who'd stood by, their support heartening but bittersweet. It wasn't their burden to bear, but they carried it nonetheless, if only for a moment. As evening fell, Elijah received a call. The voice on the other end was one he hadn't heard in years, but its familiarity was a balm against the day's events. "Captain Carter," the voice said, a note of urgency laced in its formal tone. "We need you at headquarters. Tonight." Elijah didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, though the man on the other end couldn't see it. "I'll be there." When Elijah arrived at the military base, the atmosphere was electric, a hum of activity pulsing through the halls. He was ushered into a conference room where several high-ranking officials stood around a table, their faces grim. At the center of the table was a monitor, its screen displaying a familiar face, Derek Marshall. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he took in the image. Derek was seated in an interrogation room, his posture deflated, his arrogance replaced with unease. The officials turned to Elijah as he entered, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. "Captain Carter," one of them began, gesturing toward the screen. "I'm sure you recognize him." Elijah nodded, his voice calm but firm. What's this about? The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, the official spoke again. Officer Marshall's actions today weren't just a one-off incident. He's been under investigation for months. We've uncovered a pattern of misconduct, abuse of power, racial profiling, falsifying reports. Today's incident was the last straw. Elijah's gaze didn't waver, but his chest tightened as the weight of the words sank in. He didn't need to ask why he was here, he already knew. And now you want me to confront him? The official hesitated, then nodded. He needs to understand the gravity of his actions. And we believe hearing it from you will make that impact. Elijah's jaw tightened, his emotions a storm beneath his composed exterior. He knew this wasn't just about Derek, it was about every person who'd suffered under his hand, every injustice swept under the rug. This was a moment that transcended the two of them, a chance to hold a broken system accountable. When Elijah entered the interrogation room, Derek's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the man before him. His arrogance was still there, a flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice rough with frustration. Elijah took a seat across from him, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding. "This is accountability," he said simply, his tone like steel. Derek scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You think you've won? You think any of this matters?" "It matters," Elijah replied, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Not just for me, but for every person you've hurt, every life you've disrupted. It matters because it's the truth." Derek's sneer faltered, the weight of Elijah's words chipping away at his bravado. For the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, fear. And as Elijah leaned forward, his gaze unwavering, he knew that the balance of power had shifted for good. What came next would change everything. Elijah's eyes stayed locked on Derek's as the silence between them grew heavier, the kind of silence that demanded answers, that exposed the cracks beneath even the thickest veneer of arrogance. Derek shifted in his chair, the air of confidence he had clung to now a fragile facade. His hands fidgeted on the table, fingers tapping an uneven rhythm as he searched for something, anything, to grasp onto. "You've got this all wrong," Derek said finally, his voice tinged with desperation, though he tried to hide it beneath a tone of indignation. "I was just doing my job. I followed procedure." Elijah tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady, unrelenting. "Procedure," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with deliberate weight. "Tell me, Officer Marshall, what part of your procedure involves kicking a man helping someone in need? What part of your training taught you to profile someone based on the color of their skin?" Derek's jaw tightened, his eyes darting away before snapping back to meet Elijah's. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he snapped, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. "I did what I thought was right in the moment. You don't know what it's like out there. People lie, they manipulate, they're human," Elijah interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "And so are you. At least, I assume you are, though your actions today make me wonder. You didn't see a man helping someone. You saw what you wanted to see, what you were conditioned to see, a threat." Derek's breath hitched, and for a moment, he was silent, his mind spinning as he tried to formulate a response. But Elijah wasn't done. "I've served this country for over 2 decades, Elijah continued, his tone growing heavier with emotion, though it never lost its composure. "I've stood on the front lines, made decisions that meant life or death, carried the weight of responsibility that most people can't even begin to understand. And yet, in a park, on a quiet morning, all you saw was a man in a hoodie who didn't belong. You didn't ask questions. You didn't think twice. You acted, not out of duty, but out of prejudice." Derek's face flushed red, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "You don't know me," he growled. "You don't know what I've been through, the things I've seen." "You're right," Elijah said, leaning forward slightly, his voice low but cutting. "I don't know your story. But I know your actions. And your actions have consequences. Derek's sneer returned, though it was weaker now, a shadow of the confidence he'd carried earlier. This is just some witch hunt, he said, his voice wavering despite his attempt to sound defiant. I'm a good cop. I've done my job for years, and no one's ever complained. Elijah raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. No one's complained, he echoed. Or no one's been heard. There's a difference, Officer Marshall. And today, people are listening. Derek leaned back in his chair, shaking his head as if trying to dismiss Elijah's words, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He looked at the camera in the corner of the room, the red recording light blinking steadily, a silent reminder that this wasn't just between the two of them. I get it, Derek said after a long pause, his voice softer now, almost pleading. You want me to admit I screwed up? Fine. Maybe I did. Maybe I misread the situation. But that doesn't make me some kind of monster. I'm not a bad guy. Elijah's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to pierce through Derek's facade. Being a good guy isn't about what you tell yourself in the mirror, he said. It's about what you do when no one's watching. Today, everyone was watching, and what they saw wasn't the actions of a good guy. It was the actions of someone who let their fear and bias guide them. That's not just a mistake, Officer Marshall. That's a failure. And it's one you need to reckon with. Derek's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out. He looked down at his hands, his fingers now still, the weight of Elijah's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. The silence stretched between them again, this time filled with something different, reflection, perhaps, or regret. After what felt like an eternity, Derek finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want from me? An apology? Is that what this is about? Elijah shook his head slowly, his expression softening just enough to reveal a flicker of something unexpected, compassion. An apology is a start, he said. But it's not enough. Not for me, and certainly not for the people you've hurt. What I want is for you to take a hard look at yourself and ask why you've done the things you've done. And then I want you to do better. Not because you're forced to, but because it's the right thing to do. Derek's eyes flicked up to meet Elijah's, and for the first time, there was no defiance, no arrogance, just a man grappling with the weight of his own actions. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he tried to find his voice. I don't know if I can, he said finally, his words trembling with vulnerability. Elijah leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the table. Then start small, he said. Start by admitting that you were wrong. Start by listening to the people you've silenced. Change doesn't happen overnight, Officer Marshall. But it doesn't happen at all if you're not willing to take the first step. The room fell silent again, the only sound the faint hum of the camera in the corner. Derek's shoulders sagged, the weight of everything, his actions, his excuses, his failures, finally sinking in. Elijah watched him carefully, his own emotions a quiet storm beneath his composed exterior. He knew this wasn't the end of the fight, not for Derek, not for himself, and certainly not for the countless others who faced the same battles every day. But in this moment, there was a glimmer of something, hope, perhaps, or the faintest hint of redemption. And as Elijah stood to leave, his final words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The choice is yours, Officer Marshall. It always has been. Now it's time to make it count. As Elijah left the interrogation room, his footsteps echoed in the sterile hallway, a rhythmic reminder of the weight he carried. The confrontation had drained him emotionally, but there was a clarity in his mind now, a sense that what had just unfolded was more than a moment, it was a turning point. The weight wasn't his alone anymore. Derek Marshall, for all his faults and resistance, had been forced to look in the mirror, to reckon with the kind of man he'd become. Whether he chose to change or not was yet to be seen, but the seed had been planted. Elijah entered a quiet debrief room, where two of the high-ranking officials who had been observing from the other side of the glass were waiting. Their expressions were solemn, their posture rigid. One of them, a tall man with graying hair and a voice that carried the authority of decades of command, spoke first. "That was something, Captain Carter. Not everyone could have handled it the way you did." Elijah sat down across from them, leaning back slightly in his chair. "It wasn't about handling him," he said. "It was about holding him accountable." The other official, a woman with piercing eyes and a clipboard tucked under her arm, nodded. "We've been tracking Marshall for months. Your encounter with him today was the tipping point we needed. The department has already been notified. An internal review is underway." Elijah's expression remained neutral, though his jaw tightened slightly. "And what happens in the meantime? He's not the only one. Officers like him don't operate in a vacuum. They're supported, enabled. This doesn't stop with him." The woman sighed, her voice quieter now. "We know. And you're right. Addressing him is just the beginning, not the end." The older man leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "This is a fight that's bigger than any one of us, Captain. You've done more than most would in your position. You should be proud of that." Pride wasn't what Elijah felt. He felt exhaustion, the kind that ran deeper than physical fatigue, a weariness born from years of fighting battles that seemed endless. "Pride doesn't fix systems," he said simply. "It doesn't change lives." The older man studied Elijah for a moment before nodding slowly. "No, it doesn't. But it starts conversations. And sometimes, that's the only way forward." Elijah let the words hang in the air, their truth undeniable yet insufficient. He rose to his feet, signaling that the discussion was over. "I hope you're right," he said before turning and leaving the room. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the base. Elijah stood for a moment, letting the cool evening air wash over him. His mind drifted back to the park, to the faces in the crowd, to the murmurs of disbelief and support. He thought of the elderly man he'd helped, of the young woman who'd spoken up, of the cameras that had captured every second. The truth was out now, and there was no putting it back in the bottle. But what came next was out of his hands. Over the next few days, the fallout from the incident began to ripple outward. Videos of Derek's confrontation with Elijah spread across social media like wildfire, sparking heated debates and widespread outrage. The footage was undeniable, Derek's aggression, his assumptions, the way he had escalated without cause. But what struck a chord with viewers was Elijah's composure, his refusal to stoop to Derek's level. People saw in him a strength that transcended the moment, a quiet defiance that resonated deeply. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a symbol of the larger issues plaguing law enforcement and society as a whole. Interviews with witnesses painted a vivid picture of the events, adding layers of detail that made it impossible to dismiss as an isolated incident. The elderly man, whose name was Mr. Halpern, became an unexpected voice of advocacy, speaking out about what he had seen and the injustice Elijah had faced. "I don't care what uniform someone wears or what badge they carry," Mr. Halpern said during one televised interview. "Right is right and wrong is wrong. And what I saw that day was wrong." Derek Marshall, meanwhile, found himself at the center of a storm he couldn't escape. The internal review began immediately, pulling up years of complaints and accusations that had previously been ignored or buried. His colleagues were divided, some stood by him, insisting he was a good officer who had made a mistake, while others distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his actions. Derek himself remained silent, his world shrinking as the consequences of his choices closed in around him. Elijah watched it all unfold from a distance, his name and face splashed across headlines and screens. He didn't seek out the attention, but he didn't shy away from it either. He gave a few interviews, his words measured and thoughtful, focusing on the broader issues rather than his personal experience. "This isn't about me," he told one reporter. "It's about what I represent. It's about the people who don't get the chance to speak up, who don't get the chance to walk away. If my story can help shine a light on that, then I'll tell it. But this fight doesn't end with me. The days turned into weeks, and the story continued to evolve. Protests erupted in the city, peaceful but powerful, with signs and chants calling for change. Elijah attended one of the rallies, standing among the crowd as just another voice, another face in the sea of people demanding justice. It wasn't about him, it never had been. It was about the system, about the lives it affected, about the need for accountability and reform. Derek's case moved forward, and the evidence against him mounted. Each new revelation painted a damning picture of a man who had abused his power for years, shielded by a system that allowed it to happen. Elijah followed the updates quietly, his focus shifting back to his work and his family. He didn't need to see Derek's downfall to feel vindicated. His goal had never been revenge, it had been justice. But even as the situation reached its boiling point, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one step in a much longer journey. Change was slow, often painfully so, and the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Still, he was determined to keep walking it, one step at a time. As the days continued to pass, the weight of the incident began to settle in different ways for everyone involved. Elijah had returned to the rhythm of his life, though the echoes of what had happened followed him everywhere. Strangers stopped him on the street, their faces filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. Some shared their own stories, moments when they had felt powerless, invisible, or unjustly targeted. Others simply offered a handshake, a nod, or a few quiet words of thanks. Elijah accepted these gestures with humility, though they only deepened the quiet storm within him. He had become a symbol for something larger, but the cost of that role was a constant reminder of the work still to be done. One afternoon, Elijah found himself sitting across from his longtime mentor, Colonel William Hayes, in the quiet corner of a bustling coffee shop. The colonel had been a guiding force in Elijah's military career, a man whose wisdom and steady hand had shaped many of his decisions over the years. Now, Hayes sat back in his chair, studying Elijah with a mixture of pride and concern. "You've always been a man who steps into the fire when others back away," Hayes said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of years of experience. "But I have to ask, how are you holding up?" Elijah took a sip of his coffee, the warmth of the mug grounding him as he considered the question. "I'm fine," he said after a moment, though the words felt heavier than he intended. "Or at least as fine as anyone can be in a situation like this." Hayes raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical but not unkind. "You've always been good at keeping your emotions in check, but I know you, Elijah. This isn't just about what happened in that park, is it?" Elijah sighed, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. "No," he admitted. "It's not. That moment, it was just a spark. But the fire's been burning for a long time. Every time I think about it, I can't help but see all the other times, the ones that didn't go viral, the ones where there was no crowd, no cameras, no accountability." Hayes nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "You're carrying a heavy burden. It's not just yours to carry, though. You've got people behind you now, people willing to step up and share the load. Don't forget that." Elijah looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "I know. But sometimes it feels like no matter how much progress we make, it's never enough. The system's so broken, so entrenched, and people like Derek, they're just symptoms of a much bigger disease." The colonel leaned forward, his voice firm but compassionate. "You're right, Elijah. The system is broken. But change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without people like you standing up and refusing to accept the status quo. You're making people see, making them listen. That's how it starts." Elijah met Hayes's gaze, the words settling over him like a blanket on a cold night. He nodded, a small but significant gesture of acceptance. "I just hope it's enough." Later that evening, Elijah received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost unrecognizable, but the weight of its tone was unmistakable. It was Derek Marshall. Elijah's first instinct was to hang up. The sound of Derek's voice brought a flood of emotions, anger, frustration, exhaustion, but he pushed them down, his military training taking over. "What do you want?" Elijah asked, his voice steady but cold. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Derek finally spoke. "I don't know why I'm calling," he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost fragile. "Maybe I needed to say something." Elijah didn't respond immediately, his silence urging Derek to continue. "I've been sitting with what you said," Derek went on, his words coming slowly, as if each one was a struggle. "And I can't stop thinking about it. About everything. You were right. About me, about what I've done. And I don't know how to fix it." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened, his mind racing as he processed Derek's words. "You can't fix what's already been done," he said finally, his tone firm but not unkind. "But you can start by taking responsibility. By making sure it doesn't happen again. Not to anyone else." Derek let out a shaky breath, the sound of it crackling through the receiver. "I don't even know where to start." Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, his thoughts swirling. He didn't owe Derek anything, not his time, not his understanding, not his forgiveness. But deep down, he knew that change, real change, required more than just accountability. It required transformation. "Start by listening," Elijah said. "Listen to the people you've ignored, the ones you've hurt. Let their voices guide you. And when it gets hard, and it will get hard, don't stop. That's where the real work begins." Derek was silent for a long time, the weight of Elijah's words filling the space between them. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I needed to say I'm sorry. For what it's worth." Elijah's chest tightened, the words stirring something deep within him. He didn't reply right away, letting the moment stretch out, the complexity of it settling over them both. "Sorry doesn't erase what happened," he said at last. "But it's a start. What matters is what you do next." When the call ended, Elijah sat in silence, the stillness of his apartment a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions inside him. He didn't know if Derek would follow through, if his words would translate into action. But for the first time, there was a flicker of something new, a possibility, fragile but real. The days that followed were filled with echoes of that conversation. Elijah threw himself back into his work, his family, the things that grounded him. But the incident, and everything it had sparked, continued to ripple outward. The protests grew, voices rising together in a chorus that demanded change. And though Elijah didn't seek the spotlight, his name remained a symbol, a reminder of the fight that lay ahead. Through it all, Elijah carried the words of Colonel Hayes with him: "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without people like you." The weeks stretched into months, and the ripples from that fateful day at the park continued to grow. Elijah tried to settle back into his routine, focusing on his duties and finding solace in the simple moments with his family. Yet, the echoes of the confrontation remained ever present. The world seemed to have attached itself to his story, pulling him into a spotlight he hadn't sought but couldn't escape. Each new headline, each new protest, each new conversation about justice and reform felt like both a reminder of what he had endured and a call to keep moving forward. One evening, after putting his young niece to bed during a family visit, Elijah sat on the porch with his sister, Denise. The night air was cool, the distant hum of crickets filling the silence between them. Denise handed him a mug of tea, her eyes soft but searching as she watched him. "You've been quiet tonight," she said, breaking the silence. "Even more than usual." Elijah gave her a small smile, his fingers curling around the warm mug. "Just thinking." "About him?" she asked, her tone gentle but knowing. She didn't have to say Derek's name for Elijah to understand. "About everything," he admitted. "Him, the people who've reached out, the ones who've stayed silent. The way the world feels like it's shifting and standing still all at once. Denise nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's a lot to carry. But you don't have to carry it alone, you know. You've got people, family, friends, a whole community behind you. Elijah sighed, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. I know. And I'm grateful for that. But sometimes, it feels like no matter how many people stand with you, the weight doesn't get any lighter. Denise leaned forward, resting her hand on his arm. You've always been the strong one, Eli. Even when we were kids, you were the one holding us together. But strength isn't about carrying everything on your own. It's about knowing when to let others help. Her words settled over him, both a comfort and a challenge. He nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers. I'll try. As the night deepened, Elijah's thoughts returned to Derek. The call they'd shared still lingered in his mind, the raw vulnerability in Derek's voice a stark contrast to the man he'd faced in the park. It wasn't forgiveness Elijah felt, he wasn't sure he was ready for that, but there was a seed of understanding, a recognition that even someone like Derek could change, if he chose to. The following week, Elijah received an unexpected invitation. The police department was hosting a community forum, an opportunity for dialogue between officers and residents. To Elijah's surprise, the invitation wasn't just to attend, it was to speak. He hesitated at first, unsure if his presence would make a difference or if it would only stir the pot further. But after some thought, and encouragement from Denise, he decided to accept. The auditorium was packed on the evening of the event, a mix of community members, activists, and uniformed officers filling the rows. The tension in the room was palpable, a charged energy that crackled like static in the air. Elijah sat near the front, his posture calm but alert, as the event began with a series of speeches from local leaders and police officials. The words were careful, measured, often leaning toward platitudes, and Elijah could feel the frustration building in the room. When his name was called, a hush fell over the crowd. Elijah rose, his movements deliberate, and walked to the podium. He paused for a moment, letting his gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of those who looked to him with hope, skepticism or something in between. I wasn't sure I wanted to be here tonight, he began, his voice steady but resonant. Not because I don't believe in dialogue, but because I know how these conversations can go. Too often, they turn into a lot of talking and very little listening. But I came anyway, because I believe in something bigger than dialogue. I believe in accountability, in action, and in the possibility of change. He let his words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. What happened to me in that park wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just one bad cop having one bad day. It was a symptom of something deeper, something systemic. And if we're not willing to confront that, to dig into the roots of the problem, then all the talking in the world won't make a difference. Elijah's gaze shifted to the row of officers seated near the front, their faces a mix of stoicism and discomfort. I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame. I'm here to ask for something simple, honesty. Honesty about what's broken, about what needs to change, and about what it's going to take to fix it. The crowd murmured in agreement, the energy in the room shifting slightly as Elijah's words sank in. He continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. Change isn't easy. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, and it's slow. But it's necessary. And it starts with all of us, officers, community members, leaders, looking at ourselves and asking the hard questions. Not just what we've done, but what we've allowed to happen. Not just who we are, but who we want to be. As he finished, the room erupted into applause, a wave of emotion washing over him. Elijah stepped down from the podium, his heart pounding, as he returned to his seat. He hadn't expected to feel so exposed, so raw, but there was also a sense of release, a weight lifted even as the work ahead loomed large. After the event, people approached him one by one, their words blending into a chorus of gratitude, support, and hope. Among them was a young officer, her uniform crisp and her expression earnest. She introduced herself as Officer Ramirez and thanked Elijah for his words, her voice tinged with emotion. "I joined this department because I wanted to make a difference," she said. "But sometimes, it feels like the system is too big, too broken to change. Hearing you speak tonight, it reminded me why I started. Thank you for that." Elijah nodded, his voice gentle but firm. "Don't lose that fire. Change doesn't happen without people like you willing to push for it, even when it's hard." As the crowd thinned and the night deepened, Elijah found himself standing alone near the exit. He looked back at the room, now nearly empty, and felt a quiet sense of resolve. The path ahead was long, and the fight was far from over. But tonight had been a step, a small but significant step towards something better. And as he walked into the night, the words of Denise and Colonel Hayes echoed in his mind, a reminder that strength wasn't about carrying the weight alone, it was about knowing when to let others share it. The months following the forum brought a whirlwind of change, the kind that left permanent marks on the lives it touched. For Elijah, life had settled into a new rhythm, one defined by purpose rather than quiet routine. The viral nature of his story had opened doors he never expected, giving him a platform to advocate for change on a scale that still felt surreal. He wasn't just a man who stood tall in the face of injustice, he had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that courage could be found in the most ordinary moments. Derek Marshall's story took a different turn. The internal review led to his suspension, a consequence that forced him to confront the choices he had made and the beliefs that had shaped them. In the quiet of his own home, away from the badge and the authority it gave him, Derek began to see himself in ways he never had before. The call with Elijah replayed in his mind constantly, each word chipping away at the walls he'd spent years building. He sought counseling, a step that was as much about reckoning with his own past as it was about understanding the pain he had inflicted. For Derek, redemption wasn't a singular moment, it was a slow, often painful process. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to try. The police department, under mounting pressure from the community, implemented a series of reforms, including mandatory training on bias and accountability measures for officers accused of misconduct. The changes were met with resistance in some quarters, but the momentum was undeniable. Activists who had spent years fighting for these measures finally saw the fruits of their labor, though they knew the work was far from over. Elijah watched from a distance, his role in the movement evolving from reluctant symbol to active participant. One evening, Elijah received an invitation he couldn't refuse. It was from Officer Ramirez, the young officer he had met at the forum. She had organized a panel discussion between officers and community members, a continuation of the dialogue Elijah had helped spark. When he arrived, he found a room filled with people eager to bridge the divide, their conversations charged with both tension and hope. Ramirez stood at the center, her leadership evident in the way she commanded the room with quiet authority. She introduced Elijah as a guest speaker, and when he stood to address the crowd, the room fell silent. He spoke not as a victim but as a man who had faced a moment of injustice and chosen to rise above it. He talked about the importance of listening, of acknowledging the pain that so often went unspoken, and of the power of collective action. By the time he finished, the room was buzzing with energy, the kind that signaled real progress was being made. For Elijah, the satisfaction wasn't in the applause or the recognition, it was in the conversations that continued long after the panel ended. He saw officers sitting with residents, their voices overlapping in a mix of agreement and disagreement, but always with respect. He saw Ramirez standing tall, her eyes alight with determination, and he felt a glimmer of hope that the future could be different. As he left the event, Elijah was approached by Mr. Halpern, the elderly man he had helped that day in the park. Halpern's gratitude had never wavered, and he had become a quiet but steadfast supporter of Elijah's efforts. Now, he extended a hand, his voice warm but firm. "You've done something remarkable here," he said. "Don't stop. People are watching, and they're learning from you." Elijah smiled, shaking Halpern's hand. "I won't stop," he promised. "Not until it's better for everyone." The resolution of Elijah's journey wasn't a singular event but a series of moments, each one building on the last. His story didn't end with a grand finale, it continued in the lives he touched, the systems he helped challenge, and the hope he inspired in those who had felt powerless for so long. He remained committed to his role, balancing his advocacy with his responsibilities as a soldier, a brother, and a man determined to leave the world better than he found it. For Derek, the road to redemption was long and uncertain, but he took it one step at a time. He joined the very training programs he had once dismissed, not as an instructor but as a participant. He listened to the stories of those who had suffered, allowing their voices to shape his understanding of the world. Though his career as a police officer was over, he found purpose in using his experience to educate others, speaking out about the dangers of unchecked bias and the importance of accountability. In the end, the story wasn't about a single confrontation or even a single man. It was about the ripples created by that moment, the way it forced people to look at themselves and their world with fresh eyes. It was about the conversations it started, the change it inspired, and the hope it gave to those who had long since stopped believing in it. This story reminds us of the power of standing up, even when it feels like the weight of the world is against you. It shows us that change isn't easy, and it isn't quick, but it is possible. It's a reminder that every action, no matter how small, can create ripples that grow into waves. What would you do in Elijah's place? How would you face a moment of injustice, knowing the world was watching? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it gave you hope, be sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. We're here to bring you more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us all of the strength we carry within. Thank you for being part of this journey.